up, or one mic? One or two mics? How many mics do we have? There's one mic, so if anyone would like to ask a question, if you can line up there at the mic. Go ahead.
I do. You're talking about lowering consumption, and in this country where, as you know, in America, the business of America is business. And 24 hours a day, all of us are being broadcast with buy, consume, consume, consume. And I think the most glaring example of this was the day after what was purported to be the worst attack on this nation since the white people arrived in the first place. The resident of the White House told the American people that the best thing we can do is go shopping. How can we achieve any kind of sustainability when the corporate control of the media and our infotainment are telling us constantly to consume, consume, and consume, and consume? And then the consumption, it's not only a matter of consumption, we're being told that we are what we own, we are what we buy, we are what we wear, we are what we drive. This is what drives the consumption in this country. It's not everybody just going out and on their own deciding, gee, I need all this crap. It's because we are being propagandized 24 hours a day with this message. And how do you deal with this?
Open to anyone to respond.
I guess I would just amplify the idea. This is a major turning point in the development of modern industrial society, in which long-standing habits, which even my parents had, by the way, of saving things, buying things that would last a long time, things that were durable, repairable. My father, for example, would never buy something from a hardware store if he could make it by hand himself. Those habits, which used to be common in our own country, were essentially thrown out and trashed by ideas of consumerism, the throwaway society, planned obsolescence, and this became the great driving mechanism of what's called economic growth. So to ponder a kind of society, which I would say we desperately need, based upon a steady state economy, not upon just simply driving the economic growth engine to a point of crisis, is an interesting engineering challenge, technical challenge, economic challenge, but one which I think our habits of mind, as the woman pointed out, are ill-equipped to confront currently. We're still getting all the stuff. I would add to her point about consuming and buying and so forth. You look at the media, the way advertising is presented, what happens in our movies, our video games, and so forth. The other major theme is we are just drenched every hour of the day in images of violence, which we then, unfortunately, go to the world to enact.
I thought this idea represented a consumer viewpoint until I heard it expressed by a nuclear power company that wants to not throw away its reactor, but run it till it's at least 80 years old.
Well, I mean, I quite agree. I think the question was raised, what do we do about it? It seems to me that it has to be on an individual basis to a very large extent. I mean, that the philosophy that was just spoken of earlier, use it up, wear it out, make it do or do without. That was something that was, an article of faith a long time ago, and people don't think that way at all today. Partly it is because we're bombarded all the time with images dangled before us of something that we should want. I think that we have to talk about these things. We have to try to resist that that call to buy and then throw everything away. I mean, we throw everything out. And today, for instance, you take your car to have it fixed, and most mechanics simply take the part out that is failing and replace it. They don't fix it because they don't know how to fix it. And it is a malaise of our society. I quite agree. I I just try to deal with it myself on an individual basis and not buy anything I don't really have a real need for, just because it's the latest, newest thing on the market.
I'm going to jump in with one thought on it myself. There's two reasons, or two of the reasons that I feel optimistic for our society are this. One is that there's a little cracking of the dam of being able to talk about conservation, which includes these things that have been brought up already. And the other is that I start to see, and maybe I'm in my own little fairyland here, but I'm starting to see a dissatisfaction among people at constantly being dissatisfied. In other words, you have to be in a state of constant dissatisfaction to want to buy something more when you already are the richest society on the face of the planet. And I do see some dissatisfaction in being perpetually in that state.
Yes, I think there are places which one can look at for hopeful tendencies. During the Depression, a lot of people talk about the value of string and the value of paper. And my aunt, if you tried to put tin foil in the trash can, you'd get beat, because she suffered on the have-nots, and there were mostly have-nots, but there were haves too, and they had a new car every year, etc., throughout the Depression. So the haves and the have-nots, I think there's a ratio there that's important in this construct. I call it fatal consumerism in a book review that I did once, in terms of this, our ability to go out there and satisfy that. And it's interesting to me, because I'm one that stays in the parking lot reading while my wife goes in to purchase, because I just cannot do it. After living in various places around the world, I'm so shocked by walking in and seeing everything that it has a visceral response to me. And I sit in the car and read, and my wife's perfectly happy with that. So there's some ethics involved that again, came out of places like, in places today that don't have it. And if you live in a third world country, developing country, you'll see that we had in this country during the Depression. So the potential is there, and the lessons still are there. But I'm brought into a little optimism, and I highly recommend another book. We like to recommend books and places to search afterwards, because this is only a start. Paul Hawken and the Blessed Unrest. How many people have read that book? Yes. Blessed Unrest. Okay, there's my recommendation, other than the last little polar bear. But the Blessed Unrest, Paul Hawken in his book talks about, if you look at the conditions of the planet and and you're not depressed, you're not looking at the right information. It's a nice start. But he says if you look at what's going on, and he has a thing called Wiser Earth that's working through things like MoveOn.org and others, social networks and what's happening. He says if you look at what's going on with all these NGOs and social networks that are taking this so you don't have to be the Lone Ranger, and you're not optimistic, then you don't have a heart. So it's interesting that at a time we can look at the silver lining, and the silver lining is that you represent a critical mass of thinkers and dialogue makers, and if you're tired of being not happy about things, there are other people that will connect with, and it's just the click of the mouse, and you're now communicating with others of like minds, and experiments in Mexico that are doing something about it.
Well, my personal response to this is we have no TV, so we don't watch all these ads. My wife, we both have our undergraduate degrees in music, actually. My wife has a Steinway piano. We love playing together. We love, in lots of ways, actually. We love reading. There's so much interesting stuff to read. We love going out, walking. There's so much to do. We just don't need to expose ourselves to that. And what's been particularly joyous for us, speaking of Mexico, thank you, is the Mexicans are generally poor. And so they can't buy lots of things. So we see them on Saturday and Sunday, in particular on Sunday, going having picnics. The parks are jammed with Mexicans doing something they can afford to do, which is to have picnics. And in the evenings, you'll see them sitting, the kids playing on the street, and the parents sitting on the sidewalk with their feet dangling over the curb, all happily sort of meeting with other neighbors. And they have wonderful families, wonderful. They are a wonderful, warm, joyous people. The fathers are constantly holding hands and cuddling and kissing their children when they're together. And the family unit is the important activity for the Mexicans. So this begins to suggest that there's another kind of ethic for living that's not based upon just consumer and throw away. Yes, we've gotten away from that. And the industrial, I don't know what to do, to how to help us find some of those fundamental values that can replace this ridiculous consumerism. But clearly that's what we need to do.
Next question.
I'd really like to thank you, gentlemen, for coming down and for this conference. This has been absolutely fascinating, and very grateful to you folks. And I've learned, I've reduced my ignorance by 0.1%, but at any event, it's progress. So it's a wonderful opportunity for us. I am not handicapped by knowing anything whatsoever. I can just barely tell fission from fusion, you know. But I'm encouraged because what everybody has said here, I think I listened very carefully to everyone. It's not a science problem. It's a problem of human nature and the way we act. And I'm kind of encouraged because that's all we have to do is change the way people think and act, and the problem is over. Comments?
Not more than I've said.
No, I concur, and I'm really pleased that that's what you drew from this.
I'll respond again on that. I just did this community discussion on conservation. We called it a, am I on here? We called it a conservation state of mind, and I based it simply on a experience I had when I first started working with the park system. We had a cruise on one of our lakes, and it was called the Beaver Cruise. We went out looking for beavers. Unfortunately, on a reservoir, it's kind of a hit or miss proposition to find beavers because they might be there, they might not. But we'd go out and we'd see bald eagles, herons, beautiful scenery, all sorts of things. We'd come back and people were bummed. They hadn't seen beaver. And it was amazing that all these other things, so much positivity is around them, and yet they left dissatisfied. So we changed the name of the cruise to the Wildlife Cruise. And immediately, next trip, everyone was deliriously happy with the experience. Now, I don't want to oversimplify things and suggest that that's the singular solution to everything, but there's a lot of power there. In other words, that and anything else we can do should be enlisted to get into a new state of mind to where what we do is transformed from within rather than from without, I guess. Other thoughts on that one? Okay.
Well, I'm thankful that it seems that everyone is pretty much in agreement that nuclear, even though it's a wonderful toy and a necessary technology, will is probably something that needs to be restricted and or at least used as a stopgap. But I think you also were addressing the issues of the needs for conservation and the needs for reduction in demand. And even though I'm realizing that there's a great deal of that we as individuals seem to be able to do to be conscientious and decrease our own personal demands on the networks in which we reside. I find a particular problem and an issue with what happens in regards to the amount of energy that's being used in our name, the proportional fragments that are being done, the amounts of energy that's being used by businesses and the businesses that we work in, the businesses that we work for, that are spending or using tremendous amounts of energy in order to attract our business and are spending these resources in our name. And I'm wondering, what suggestions might there be in regards to how to reduce those demands, beyond, and being able to have an effect beyond that which, we can personally reduce.
I'll take a crack at that. Everything you buy got here on a truck, and it came here using diesel fuel. You can start raising your own food, but you won't be eating the way you eat now. I travel around the country and go to fairly fancy restaurants. There's always fresh fish on the menu. It always got there by jet plane. The airplane itself is made out of aluminum that is energy intensive to make. I think you've got a really tough problem. I don't aspire to moving off into the woods and living off the land. I think a better question is, how do you demand that the supply chain deliver a quality of life to you without wrecking the planet? And the answer to that is you price it. You put a price on carbon, you put a price on other forms of pollution, and then you attack the cheapest reductions first and move on as you think it's necessary to the more expensive reductions. That might or might not be a recipe for building more reactors. It might turn out that the cheap way to reduce carbon is to sequester emissions from coal-fired power plants, or it might turn out it's cheaper to replace the coal-fired power plant with a reactor. Or it might turn out it's cheaper to replace these lights with something that's more energy efficient and use new biologically derived materials, etc. You need a common medium of exchange to figure out how to do these things, because people won't do it out of the goodness of their hearts, and that medium of exchange is probably money.
I'd like to offer that in the culinary vein, a counter argument would be by Miss Judy Wicks, who runs the White Dog Cafe in Philadelphia. Now she pays all her employees a living wage, dishwashers, etc. When all her competition was saying you don't do that, she began working on organic and local farmers. So she's gone out and developed a community and then engaged them with the other restaurants in Philadelphia, and now is giving lectures and training in New York and Philadelphia and other places. Because the model was you can't do that, you had to drive a long way, etc., to have the food. And she basically disproved that hypothesis. But again, it's by your experience. And if it wasn't for the Judy Wicks of the world, of the White Dog Cafe in Philadelphia, for those that wish to track things down, we wouldn't understand that it was a viable model and that all her staff are paid minimum wage. So when we look at economics, and everybody keeps quoting Adam Smith and the silent hand, and we realize, no, we bought in on a lot of concepts and paradigms that are being disproven community by community, industry by industry. And that's where I find hope, and that's what I think that Paul Hawken in Blessed Unrest is tapping into, is that there are a lot of Judy Wicks running around. And there's people doing innovation in Brooklyn that are restoring the community, restoring, putting in self-energy issues, and making restoration part of the community where everybody benefits. So what we need to do is look at those paradigms and cast aside the others so that you can begin engaging in those businesses. And when you started talking about the lights and how they attract, I'm just thinking of my 5 years of tenure in Las Vegas and going, what could I do about that? Well, I moved, because that was, if there's a place that needs to be removed from the planet, Las Vegas is the one.
Hi, my name's Ashley, and I'm familiar with the Gaia theory that you are talking about, and I think it's very feasible. And I don't think it's a question of, I think the Earth will definitely live longer than we will and be able to shake off any, impurities that we've left. So my question is, when is it not an economic issue? When is it, I think basically every time that we do something, or every time, we pollute and such, the Earth it's inevitable, the Earth is going to fight back. And when is it not, about economics? And when, I don't know, we have to either put that aside or have economics work with us and such. You get it?
I'd love to take a crack at that. The solution to the carbon problem is probably finding energy sources that are cheaper. The way you displant the easiest way to displant dirty technology is to find something that's cleaner. So look at whaling and lighting lamps with whale oil. We managed almost to wipe out the whales, but eventually we got to kerosene, which is a better light source. And the question is, what is going to be the better energy source? Speaking of the Earth fighting back, I wanted to get back to Yucca Mountain for just a moment and how the Earth, well, Ashley, you said that the Earth will live longer than we will. It certainly won't be the other way around. But there's a volcanic structure at Yucca Mountain, near Yucca Mountain, called Wells Lathrop Cone. It's made of cinders from a volcano. When the Department of Energy went out there and looked at Yucca Mountain and said, this is where we want to build, they said Wells Lathrop Cone is 100,000 years old. Now that's a very important calculation because you really don't want to put your nuclear waste on a volcanic site. Later on they came back and they said, well, you know, it's not really, it's probably only about 5,000 years old, which you start getting nervous about. The joke out there is that the next time you calculate the date of the event that created Wells Lathrop Cone, the event won't have happened yet. So you have to worry about the Earth biting back.
I'll take a crack at that. And first I have to come out with economics, even though you did ask not about economics. There have been very good calculations on the cost, the cost per kilowatt hour that would accrue to consumers by different technologies used to sequester. And coal comes out the most expensive. Coal comes out considerably more expensive than nuclear. Both of those come out about equivalent to solar thermal electric and considerably more expensive than wind. It's not a matter of just the economics in this issue, because the economics don't really work when we start talking about fantasy games of, if you look at the amount of CO2 you'd have to pump down from every coal plant, which just fortunately would be situated on a geological strata that would just happen to work. But the question really dealt with how do we get away from these economic things? And one way to get away from them is to start trying to avoid having our money spent for energy, such as the loan guarantees for nuclear and so on, that are out of our control and that we don't believe in and that we don't want to do. That we need to start being able to spend our money, here I'm talking about money again, in ways that benefit us as directly as possible. I do have to respond to Matthew at the very end, as I will, because I do disagree with him. But I also point out these Mexican examples. I don't live in a barrio in Mexico. I live in a lovely hacienda house on the shore of Lake Chapala. And we've redone it now for energy efficiency. We're putting 2 kilowatts of PV in the roof. We're building a little office, which is passive solar, to reveal how to do that. And we do have land next to it, so we are planting a fruit orchard and vegetable garden. It's a nice thing to do when you can. But the important thing to us is that we're doing these things and that other people are seeing. There's about 4,000 Americans and Canadians who live in this community of a total of about 10,000 there on the north shore of Lake Chapala. And already many are saying, you know, we came down here to retire, but we could afford to do this. And we think it'd be really important to show a little nucleus in Mexico of people who care and to spend our money doing that. And I think that's the sort of thing that more and more people really have to start doing to try to get away just from the economic calculus.
But I wouldn't disregard, go ahead.
Well, I'm a little bit troubled by that point of view in this regard. Most of the world is becoming urbanized. Most of the population of the world is growing in cities. It's not growing in a nice, lovely place in Mexico. And it seems to me the problems that we have to deal with have to be able to, the solutions that we come up with, have to be able to deal with the fact that whether we like it or not, I don't like to live in a city. I mean, I lived in a city for 15 years and I really never liked it, New York City. I'd like to live in the country. I'd like to grow my own vegetables and so on and so forth. But the fact of the matter is the world's population is not doing that. It is going exactly the opposite way. And the solutions that we have to find are ones that are practical to be able to deliver a decent life or the needs for a decent life to people who live in cities, because that's where they're going. And I'm troubled by, you know, solutions that are kind of do-it-yourself. They're fine for those that can, but I don't see that as a solution for people who live in urban environments. And I don't see it as a solution to the question of how do you supply enough energy to run a steel mill. I mean, it seems to me that these massive consumption centers of energy have to be dealt with in their own way. And perhaps perhaps wind energy can help and so on and so forth. But I think that you have to also address this problem from the point of view that there are concentration centers of usage that are just going to grow. They're not going to get smaller. Once in a while they do, but more or less. And that the technologies that deliver the needs to those centers have to do the job. And I don't know what the answer is, but I do think that largeness that we're lamenting in corporations and the impact of corporations and large corporations, so on and so forth, yes, has produced ills. But sometimes the only way to deliver something to a very large concentration, market concentration, is a system which is fairly large and and does benefit from economies of scale because of its size.
I'll agree with half of what Ken has to say, because the 50% are urban and 50% are rural, and that's the rub. So I'm agreeing with him on many of the points, but say that lumping it all into one area is not going to be a satisfactory response. And if we look at things like what the Germans have a standard for the Autohaus, passive energy, so that there's no requirement for heating or cooling based on electricity, oil, or anything else. And they've had this standard for a while. They're promulgating it so people can vote with their coupons and say, I want a house that's like that because I don't want to be paying electricity, and I don't want to be paying for electricity to heat or cool my house. So there are ways that we can deal with that. In the economics, one of our major challenges is the true cost accounting. We're subsidized in so many areas, and this panel certainly knows it, and many of you there, that if you go into full life cycle accounting, you're going to find out that the economies are swayed one way or another by the policies and the machinations involved in subsidizing major components of the energy for many, many years. In fact, our national highway system is a tremendously subsidized phenomenon. And if you follow James Howard Kunstler's books on the geography of nowhere or the long emergency, you'll realize that this predisposes us to certain solutions based on whether we're and I'd live in the woods, thank goodness, or we live in concentrated centers. So I think that it's, one is to divide it into 50-50 and begin looking at these. I also agree that until the home-baked systems and the homemades for entrepreneurs that are capable aren't going to work in the masses. And the numbers, there's 303 million people here living in this country, more or less. It's going to have to be, can we go to Home Depot and are they selling a system that I can now install in my house? Can I go and get the write-off so I can amortize this over 10, 20 years? So there's a lot of things going involved here, and it's not a simple solution. But where are we going to get those solutions from? And where are the trusted centers? And so I'm going to end up with, well, I could go to the governments for solutions. I'm not going there. I've been lied to and cheated for too many years. So again, that's my personal cross to bear. But I don't go to the government for honest brokerage of information anymore. But I do trust universities. I do trust universities to raise the issues up and to provide forums so that we can find it. And I'll tell you, the universities get an F, and Virginia Tech gets an F for your ability to get that information to the citizens. So the challenge is back on you to help as a community to think about how do we present this so that someone who's not in Engineering 101 or sociology, or some other course can understand these things. So it's, again, the onus is back.
I'd like to respond to Tim's last point. One reason the universities are doing such a bad job is they're being rapidly corporatized. You're getting the infusion of the modern, yes? I would include my own university among them. The idea that you need vast infusions of research money, which usually come either from government or corporate grants that serve a certain kind of set of agendas, and the question of what the world needs, what people need, what the environment needs, how to respond to the most urgent questions of our time. This is pushed way off the agenda. And it involves increasingly some rather fierce fights within these wonderful institutions to try to take them to a point where they're actually responsive to other agendas than what the chemical companies, oil companies, energy companies, and so forth have in mind.
Donna, say
I need to bring buildings into this equation because we're talking about cities. And I couldn't disagree with what Ken Rogers has been saying, and I certainly don't disagree with the importance of allowing developing nations to have energy and to grow. I actually agree with much of what you've been saying. I won't put a percentage to it because I don't know. It was rather easy that he did his. Cities, let's talk about cities. They're collections of buildings. Let's go back to the very first question on conservation and efficiency. Piece of cake to save energy in buildings. First thing we can do is go back to all the buildings in cities, and reducing their energy use by 30% is absolutely straightforward on retrofit. It's absolutely straightforward to design new buildings that use 50% less energy than the ones that we conventionally design. I was trained in architecture before I got my PhD in physics. So I do design buildings. I'm very proud that a building I designed for a campus in California just won the Sustainable Building Award for 2007 in the US. It uses 90% less energy than average buildings. Where does it get its energy from? Natural heating, natural cooling, daylighting, solar, all the kinds of things that you do, natural ventilation. These are things that we can do within cities that dramatically reduce the load of cities. The entire equivalent to the entire amount of buildings that are up in the United States, 100% of the buildings, the equivalent of that will be rebuilt in the next 30 years. We're going to add more, and we're going to take some down, and we're building new. So within the next 30 years, we have the opportunity to reduce the energy use in our buildings by 50, 60, 70%, dramatically, again, lowering the demands on the energy systems that feed the cities. And we really need to do this. If it's available, we need to do this.
Yes, sir.
We do need to link beyond economics to regulation, for example. If you look at what the big corporations are doing to get new sources of oil and power, they're turning to tar sands and looking toward coal gasification. The cost in new carbon in the air is enormous. It takes about a quarter barrel of oil to make a barrel of oil from tar sands. Yeah. And we have to somehow find a way to improve the information that is shared, the moral climate, the regulatory climate, to think through which the alternatives are, which will be best in very difficult circumstances, but to return to the big issue of what the corporations are doing, we're going to have to think of the costs in other ways than dollar costs, or find ways to regulate things in such a way that the dollar costs are calculated quite new. Carbon lasts in the air for approximately 1,000 years. The corporations do not calculate that in their calculation of the costs of producing oil one way versus another. And unless we, as a public and as governments, cope with that. So I think we have to return beyond the initiatives of individuals, which are absolutely crucial. I don't disagree with anything that's been said about that, to the issue of what we do corporately and governmentally to deal with the question about nuclear versus other sources of power.
I'd love to answer that one. This turns out to tie directly back to the subject of the panel, which, as you can tell, has wandered a bit, to nuclear power, to what is described as the perfect American reactor. Okay, you build it to generate electricity, but you take the waste heat, which is 2/3 of the heat it produces, and you use a chunk of that to process tar sands, and you displace natural gas or other hydrocarbons you would have used. That's not why it's perfect. This reactor doesn't exist yet. It's under design at the Idaho National Engineering Laboratory. The reason it's perfect is you build it in Canada. That makes it the perfect American reactor. People talk about peak oil, I don't think we're there, but it's clear that the average barrel of oil you find is heavier than it used to be, that we've used up the light, easy stuff. And you need more process energy to handle the heavier oil, and that process energy could be from that barrel, or if you're really convinced that we have a finite supply of oil, you might start using nuclear instead. These are related questions.
Others on that? Okay, sir.
Yes, good afternoon. My name is Michael. I'm a local businessman, and I'm a tech graduate. And Langdon, I'm a kindred soul of yours because I'm the local official energy peak oil catastrophist of the New River Valley. And I do lectures here in the area. I want to, one of the things that's very evident to me is the link between energy usage and population growth on the planet Earth. 200 years ago, there were 1 billion people. Now there's 6.5 billion. This is something you talked about last night briefly, Tim, that In our lifetimes, in my lifetime, the population on the planet Earth has doubled. Another doubling has ramifications that I don't think we can possibly understate. We just finished a political cycle here, and a number of people are talking about similar issues, taxation, schools, jobs, etc., but everybody's for growth. And I just wanted to ask your opinions about that, and how do we see growth as an issue? I mean, it's taken for granted that this is a necessary and, in fact, desirable condition. Do you see it that way? If you don't see it that way, how do we begin to change the dialogue, not just amongst academics, but amongst political leaders?
I'm going to say that we're going to have to rediscover what Adam Smith knew or didn't know, because I don't believe growth in the conventional sense is required. The processes, I think, has to do with flux and the energy flux, because the Earth system is the one that's been around for a long time and one that we can learn from. And the closer we do, whether you're an architect and you're like Ian McHarg and Design with Nature, or you're like Jay Harmon and PAX Scientific, which is redesigning fans to be more efficient based on nature and looking at things that have been tested for tens and hundreds and millions of years, there is a laboratory that says the true economics of the system, which are in a dynamic situation, stability is a relative term. So the idea of growth is required, I think, is a false assumption. I would say that looking at steady state systems and recognizing that some will retract and some will expand, but they need to constantly go through that, because uncontrolled expansion is failure. It will remove that species eventually. And so we need to look at that, and so I just didn't want to agree. I want to agree that population is a critical issue, absolutely. Number one, it's the number one issue for all of us. I'm child-free, so I'm guilt-free. But I'll also note that there's not one politician running for the highest office in this country that I've seen has discussed that issue. It's untouchable discussion. So, and yet, without dealing with that, how do we discuss soberly about the pragmatic issues of nuclear issues?
You're not endorsing Mitt Romney here.
God love the Mormons and the Catholics.
Yeah. I might throw out here, too, that this is another area where I see the dam cracking a little bit, and that is that this idea of steady-state economics is more palatable now than even the last 5 years in terms of more people taking a look at it. And a recommended set of readings, I guess, would be those by Herman Daly, formerly of the World Bank, now with the University of Maryland, and one of his books was called Steady State Economics. So there's a lot of thought that has gone into this, and we need to put a lot more in. Other thoughts?
David Brower, whom some of you might recognize, died recently as a famous environmentalist, said that growth is the philosophy of the cancer cell. And it does put it in perspective, as we saw here. I mentioned earlier that California's economy grew by 40%, whereas the energy use didn't grow. And consequently, California displaced the need for the equivalent of 22 new nuclear power plants by doing that. So what was the growth in, if it wasn't just in things? And the growth was in things that were valuable and interesting and efficient, and just of lots of areas. Growth doesn't necessarily have to mean just a growth in things. I find myself in a really awkward position in this panel, too. It's odd. I'm in essence placing myself as the environmentalist sitting up here talking about small is beautiful and we can do this and that in our houses, and disagreeing with Matt Wald, whom I deeply respect and read with great avid interest when he writes. That's not what I do for a living. What I do for a living is developing renewable energy and efficiency policies for governments and for utilities. That's what I do, dealing in the real world of the way real regulatory systems function and real opportunities can happen. I keep bringing out these examples that seem relevant and especially related to our living in Mexico right now. But what I do for a living is to, in part, engage in analyses. A recent paper of mine I wrote with the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, and they did all the number crunching for me to demonstrate that a transition through efficiency into renewable energy future is feasible and economic. These are not pie-in-the-sky things and little home-by-home things that we're talking about. There may be an honest disagreement on, for example, how much nuclear is in there. In my own work, I keep nuclear in. I do believe that they've gotten better at making safe reactors. And I keep nuclear in, and I keep it in at about the level at which the nuclear industry says that they can accomplish, which is 2 to 4% of the ultimate energy use we're going to be having by 2050. Those numbers come from the nuclear industry. But I just choose to deal with all of the others in the diversity of resources that we need as well. So I think we need to realize that there's a lot of practical, down-to-earth, real governmental stuff that's still related to things that we value personally. Coming back to the growth in values rather than growth in things. We really can accomplish both, and I believe I'm more of an optimist than maybe some others on the panel on this.
I'd like to respond to that also, to sound a hopeful note for the, especially the young members of the audience, the students. I think there's pretty good evidence that one of the growing industries, so it is headed actually to a kind of steady state economy, is that in fields of sustainable design, sustainable engineering, sustainable entrepreneurial efforts of various kinds, in which the targets become eliminating waste, doing things more efficiently, doing things locally, and so forth. In other words, the territory that our modern growth-oriented economy has sort of overstepped on its path to perhaps oblivion is there as a field of creativity, entrepreneurialism. You can start new businesses. I understand there's a new book. I don't know the authors that give you a kind of catalog and description of these fields called Apollo's Fire that looks at a variety of new businesses saying this is what is happening. And this is what I try to interest my students at Rensselaer in doing. And I would just talk about one thing that I have tried to do. After we defeated this coal-fired cement plant, people in the communities that I live in upstate New York said, well, what can we do to approach this goal of sustainability, a sustainable economy? And what we did was to say, well, one thing that makes some sense is to try to eliminate what Kunstler calls the 3,000-mile Caesar salad. To try to buy one's food locally, the produce, the chickens, and so forth. And what we found was that there were lots of people out there who were interested in keeping the farms alive, keeping things growing. What was missing was a kind of hub where these items can be sold and bought. And I might just say that one thing I'm going to do with the modest honorarium that I will get from coming here is to give it as a loan to something called the Real Food Co-op Market in my little town of Chatham, New York, to help further this enterprise, which will support local farmers, supply us with better foods, supply the restaurants, keep the fields green instead of this kind of build out and so forth. There are things. I think it's very important to note that if you're clever, resourceful, do your homework, talk to lots of people, there are many things that people can actually do to respond to the kinds of issues that we've been talking about this morning.
Okay, this extends real quickly. This extends internationally. If you follow Wangari Maathai's work with the Greenbelt movement. They're working in communities on a similar basis. So the model is being spread, where they're planting trees and developing businesses and educating women, developing women's clinics. So the model here that we're discovering is that it does work, and they're finding out that self-governance is one of the critical issues. People have to assume self-governance. They're going to have to create the mechanisms for economic development and accept that they're responsible. So I think it's not just a local, but I love those examples, absolutely, Langdon, but to recognize that this is something that we can export and support internationally as well.
I agree. Okay, we are 15 minutes from closing, and so we have enough time for one last question and some perhaps brief responses, because we'd like to leave 10 minutes at the end to have our final statements.
Okay.
I'd like to thank Mr. Foreman for his comment on Virginia Tech that their grade is not too good on getting information out, because I think that they're too attached to coal companies. Massey Coal Company's CEO is a graduate of Virginia Tech, and he donates a lot of money to Virginia Tech to make sure that coal is continued. As I speak, there are 3 million more pounds of diesel and fertilizer being used in the coal fields right now to blow up another mountain, the second oldest range in the world. And I take homage with Mr. Rogers' pessimistic view that the worldwide consumption cannot change. Was it not the Western world, and particularly the United States, that brought China and India to wanting what we have through fossil fuels? And if we did, in fact, divert some of the $12 billion a week from the war to the war on carbon fuels, could we not change our minds and take a leap as a country with a vision instead of these stalling tactics of your boss? Could you give me an answer, please, on why we cannot have a vision with the government, not just us as individuals? We're all asked to do our part, but our government is reversing what we started 30 years ago as a student at Virginia Tech. So can you explain this to me? Thank you.
Well, I don't know. If you're looking for an explanation of what the government does, don't look to me. I'm not very much enthusiastic. I don't have very much enthusiasm for this present administration. But my point of pessimism is not that on a specific energy consumption basis per individual, one might not be able to do that even worldwide. But I'm concerned about the population explosion wiping that out as to produce a result that is, in fact, less worldwide consumption of energy. That's my point.
Energy policy turns out to be incredibly local. We like coal because it's in a congressman's backyard. We like nuclear because we're going to stimulate the economy of Pittsburgh, where they design these things. There's a debate right now over a national renewable energy standard, and it's gotten down to a really local debate of, well, it's easy for you guys on the plains because you've got wind. I'm here in Kentucky where we don't have any wind. It's a pork barrel system where you favor one set of producers over another, and it's not actually a system, it's a concatenation. There is no large-scale rhyme or reason to the government intervention in the energy markets.
Matt brought up a great point about the local politics. How many people know Mary Hitt? You're going to have to look that one up. She's the one that's been using Google Earth to show communities what mountaintop removal looks like. She's been putting this on a Google Earth so you can zoom in your backyard and see these things, because from here you don't necessarily, but you fly over, you see it. And she's been causing an insurrection, if you will, of the local communities. And Peabody Coal, one of the spokesmen, said she's using terrorist tactics and alarmist tactics with the community by showing them these things. We're going, okay, so if you step out and look at the real world, that's considered radical terrorism tactics. So I bring that up because it's local action that is really changing door-to-door attitudes, and then they're going to have to come by and say, where do you buy your energy? So people need to realize that they're connected, and then you have to say, what can we do about it? So I'm absolutely a supporter of the local behavior that we've heard before. And please look up Mary Hitt, H-I-T-T. She's doing a lot of good work here. And again, this is something that the community and the university could be leaders in making changes.
Okay, I believe that we are at the last 10 minutes. So maybe if you have a comment that you'd like to make in approximately the 30 seconds, then go ahead and do that, but we won't have time to respond to that unless people choose to do so in their
I had a question. For the last couple of years, there's been articles about nuclear power and how it's getting tenfold more efficient and tenfold less waste. And this is kind of maybe long, but on the technology of that and how that, I'm wondering how that relates to what's going on. You're talking about nuclear power not being economically feasible from the 70s, and I'm wondering
cannot I?
Can we put these in our final comments? And towards that end, I'll scrunch mine down to 30 seconds, start off, and we'll go from this side down. I'd leave with two things. One, I'm very happy to be on this panel. It doesn't make perhaps at first a lot of direct sense why I, with my background, am here, but I think there is a big overlap with how we think about Earth systems. So one, I just encourage all of you to look at this Gaia theory. It's not kooky. It's good, accurate science, but it's also blended with that element of metaphor that I think is so needed. And then finally, this chink in the armor of conservation, I'd say, can grow if we keep it growing. Back in the 70s, when President Carter asked us to be conservative in our energy use, the phrase freeze in the dark came to be. And that wasn't a spontaneous outpouring of the human spirit in America. It was, in fact, very orchestrated. And so it's yielded a 30, 35-year taboo on talking about the subject, but that's starting to break up very quickly. And in fact, I would say that the only way we will freeze in the dark is if we don't talk about conservation. So that's my final thoughts today.
Final thought. I think we Americans, along with other nations of the world, need to drastically alter our expectations and our ways of living. And I think that if we don't do that, begin to make progress that we feel comfortable with, then we are going to face what I mentioned in the beginning, kind of ongoing panic, which will bring social chaos and recurring wars around the globe.
One really quick one, we had a lot of discussion about cities. I used a lot less energy when I lived in an apartment in New York and walked to work than I live now. It's not clear to me what the optimal situation is. It's also a problem in the energy world that we tend to get tunnel vision. We get to questions like, should we build more reactors? The real question is, how do we meet our energy and carbon needs, and how does nuclear work into that? The answer is it may not. Certainly the government has decided to put enough money in to get the ball rolling again, and we'll see how far it rolls. Thank you.
Well, I guess the point that I'd like to come back to is one that Tim touched on, and that had to do with trust. I'm very sympathetic and naturally like the whole idea of the town meeting approach and getting everybody into the act. I used to worry about how do you get everybody into the act and still get some action, which is a challenge. But I do feel that there are government organizations that we have to have, and they have to be credible, and they have to be trustworthy. And I'm not saying that they are, but I think we have to insist that they are. I spent 10 years with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. I think it's a pretty good organization, but it's certainly not perfect. I look at the Department of Energy, and I would say they are totally different kinds of animals. I don't think that the Nuclear Regulatory Agency consciously lies to the public. I don't know that I could say that about other government agencies, although they may occasionally be wrong. I hope that's still the case. What I'm saying is that we cannot throw out government as a player in this, nor can we allow ourselves to trust it totally. President Reagan, although I don't support everything that he was for, did say, trust but verify. And I think that's a very important point, that I think we have lost trust in our organizations in this country. I think it started out a long time ago. From my point of view, it's really started in the Vietnam War. But it may have started earlier, as come out in some of the things you've heard about with respect to exposure of our citizens to nuclear weapons materials. But I think somehow we've got to turn to a way of insisting that our government organizations are trustworthy and hold them accountable. I don't know entirely how to do that, but I think it is something that we cannot simply back away from and say, they're not trustworthy, so we've got to go to something else. I think we need the something else, but we also have to find a way to make our government work better for us.
I was drafted by Richard Milhouse Nixon, so I suffer from the trust factor. But I agree with my new colleague, Ken, on the statements he's making. I dip into a thing which I would say that sometimes our perspectives, and looking in the past and thinking about the future, we miss something. We really need to be in the now. And Asian benefit of working in Tibet and places is you get, sometimes you're exposed to concepts about focusing about the now. And they really do try to do it. And there's a popular book out about be in the now. So that's what we need to do. And the past is a taker, not a giver. You can learn some lessons, but let's not dwell on it. And let's not get too apocalyptic about the future, because the now is where it's all happening and you're going to miss it. And I'd love to be 21 years old again and be in the university, because when I was in the now and it was great. So it was a good time. So the now is the first thing I want to sell to you. The second is to think globally. And we've heard that phrase, it's become trite, it's a bumper sticker, my God. But I don't think, not think globally in terms of the old sense. Think globally in terms of avoiding tunnel vision. Get a more Renaissance global view. Go take the various subjects and take things to learn about that aren't in your narrow path. Broaden your horizons, and then you'll be able to appreciate the complexities that are involved in the kinds of things you care about locally. And become responsible for your actions. People are talking about this, but believe me, it starts with the individual. I don't watch TV, my wife does, so I try to sequester her to a room in the house where she's punished to watch television. You know, you've got to work on that which you might have an influence, and then work your way out. So your choices about purchasing power, etc., are based on your decisions. And then you can tell your neighbors about the solar and what you've saved in the energy, because it works. If you show them your bill and you show them how you've reduced it, they're going to buy into it. You know, teach by leadership and by example. And that's such an important role for Virginia Tech. I mean, you all are in a very privileged position. You're in the top 1% of the planet. Absolutely. Do the numbers. You're in the top 1% of the planet. What are you contributing back to the other 99%? You're graduating. It's such an honor. It's such a wonderful thing. You've got anything you want to do. What do you want to do? Go out and destroy the planet, or go out and, you know, get real productive and be vociferous about taking care of the planet and working through those? That has to be an avocation and a vocation. It has to be your whole life, and you've got to believe in it. And if you do, then you're going to be surprised at a great impact you will have. I've been mind-boggled by the impact that I had when I wasn't sure I would have some. And what I do now is I try to, and I've been developing this throughout the world, Tibet, Honduras, India, Africa, is what the community sustainable development workshops. And what we begin with is a common view of what the planet looks like. And I use satellite images. I'll bring in Google Earth now. A variety of ways. The children go out and map their communities. We share all the maps and we say, what does the community look like? What is your common vision of where you're at? Now, what would you like the future to be? And have a dialogue going on. And what are the impediments for reaching that future? It's their dialogue. I just facilitate the process and help them with some of the technology issues. Because it doesn't matter what I think the world should be like. That has nothing to do. There's 6.6 billion people that are going to outvote me. So it has to be their dialogue. And I see that that's what you could do here. You've got tremendous resources. Get the dialogue going. Use this if you're inspired. Use this panel to go out and say, by golly, I can sit there over coffee, or if you're inviting me, over beer, to talk with the neighbors and discuss this. Because these are critical, critical issues in your life and tomorrow. And I thank you for allowing us to be here.
Well done. Hey, I like beer too. I almost wish it had worked around the other way, because I'm going to be a little mundane here with just a couple of more numbers that I want to share with you, because this is really the kind of closing statement that we should all stand behind, and that was very well done. Thank you. When I just mentioned the power of buildings, I forgot to give a number, and that was that 2/3 of the nation's electricity, in the United States is used in buildings. Within the next 30 years, we can save half of that through construction, new construction, and reconstruction. That is reducing the electricity demand of our cities by 30%. That's reducing the demand. They'll be offsetting growth in electricity in other sectors. But when we come back to the cities, we have these opportunities to do it at much lower cost and much faster than we possibly could do it if we tried to build power plants to provide for more energy instead of going back in and doing it right. Secondly, a comment with regard to the value of renewable energy and farmers. This came up. The best thing that's happened to Midwestern farmers in the United States has been the wind turbines, because wind turbines go right along. They can put them right along the border of their land. It uses 1% of the farm. They go right on farming the remaining 99%, and it doubles their income. And it protects them so that if they have a bad year and a drought, and goodness knows there are a lot of droughts going on right now, they're protected by having the wind turbine income coming in. So you get this marvelous synergy between a direction toward constructing and installing new energy sources and keeping our farmers on the land so that they can grow food for us. These are the synergies that are some of the values that come into society with doing things in a new and different way. The question with nuclear is not should we build more, but could we build more? So it's no longer a value question. Let us take at face value what the nuclear industry says that they could do. They believe that they could treble the nuclear power plants that we now have if they were given complete support. There are 441 nuclear power plants in the world right now. So that's equivalent to building 1,000 power plants between now and 2050. That's one new power plant every 2.5 weeks for the next 43 years. That means you're finding the places that can make the steel. You're finding the steel. You're finding all the materials that you need. You're finding, I'm just going to ignore the whole fuel cycle at the moment. It turns out that's completely impossible. It just is. So the Energy Information Agency, the International Energy Agency, did an analysis and said that if we continue building nuclear power plants now, assume that they are supported, 2 to 3 per year is going to be the construction rate. And if we really have carbon taxes and things like that, the maximum the world could see is 6 new nuclear power plants per year. Well, if we go back to the nuclear power industry's wish list and say, look, let them build 1,000 new power plants, and they're saying that that reduces carbon emissions. Yes, it reduces 1/7 of the carbon emissions that must be reduced by 2050 if we're going to try to hold the global temperature rise to 2 degrees or hold it to 450 parts or 500 parts per million of carbon dioxide. So granting the nuclear industry its complete wish list, letting them go ahead and build them, I acknowledge they're making them much safer, they're much better, just ignore all the other issues. You've only solved 1/7 of the problem. The remaining 6/7 is going to require many other things: efficiency, conservation, and a diversity of other resources, including a heavy reliance on renewable energy resources. If you take the International Energy Agency's numbers at 6 plants per year, by the year 2050, nuclear power is displacing 2% of the carbon dioxide. The other 98% has to be displaced by other means. So if we really view it as not a matter of should we build them, but could we build them fast enough to make the difference, the answer is no. I mentioned in my own analysis, I keep a strip for nuclear power in it, roughly today's level. It has a role to play in various places, but it's always going to be a minor role. The issues are much bigger. The issues are issues that we address, as you're hearing, on our own behavior, on our own values, what we do, on how we reconstruct our communities, how we reconstruct our buildings and our cities. Those are issues that we as people can all address. And the industry needs to provide power to us, but that's not the primary issue. The primary issue is how we use that power, how we relate it to our lives, how we relate it to our future. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here.
Thank you for coming, and I'd like to thank the panel again, and I'd also like to just very quickly thank my co-organizers, Daniel Breslow, Eileen Christ, and Brandif Karen for putting this together. And of course, thank Doris Allen for starting the Choices and Challenges Forum 20 years ago. And I also invite you to please attend our afternoon session.